Our special guest is Paula Cole-Jones. Of Paula, Brock Leach writes, quote, "For most of the past 25 years, Paula Cole-Jones has devoted her considerable energies to working with church communities to increase their impact within Unitarian Universalism. She has authored and led numerous anti-racism and anti-oppression training programs, served on the National Unitarian Universalist Association Congregational Life staff, and formed a consultancy to help congregations live and reimagine themselves in a multicultural world." Brock Leach goes on to say, "Through all this work, Paula Cole-Jones began to recognize the existence of two different paradigms in Unitarian Universalist circles. On one side, the Unitarian Universalist 7 principles and the idea of a beloved community with deep multiculturalism, and on the other side, the truth that it was possible to be a good Unitarian Universalist, align with our principles, and yet not confront the reality of racism and other systemic oppressions." So, in 2017, together with Dr. Bruce Pollock Johnson, Jones drafted a proposed 8th principle intended to bridge that gap. This new 8th principle invites us to begin, quote, "journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions." This 8th principle makes anti-racism explicitly part of our Unitarian Universalist theology. Dismantling white supremacy culture becomes a religious imperative for all Unitarian Universalists. As of today, over 284 of our approximately 1,000 Unitarian Universalist congregations have officially adopted the 8th principle. Unitarian Universalist Church of Fresno adopted it in 2022. And on this very day, at this very moment, the West Side Unitarian Universalist Church in Fort Worth, Texas, will vote to become the 285th congregation. We send them much love and support as they do so. So today, instead of a sermon, Paula and I are going to share a conversation. Because of time zone differences and the limits of technology, Paula and I recorded our conversation prior to today's service, and it has been lovingly edited for length. Please welcome Paula Cole-Jones. In the time since the congregations have begun to discuss and adopt the 8th principle at that grassroots level, what changes have you already seen in Unitarian Universalism before it even gets up to the association level?
Yeah. So this is a very exciting time. It can be scary sometimes because anytime you're trying something new, right, you're going into new territory, there's a certain element of the unknown. And we're always, not always, but we're curious about, will people be open and accepting of this new idea? And then sometimes it's like the urgency and the power behind the idea is like, and we cannot afford to not do this work. So it's a very exciting time. And the eighth principle happens against a backdrop of many other things. So I want to make sure it's in its context because it didn't do the job by itself. The eighth principle captures what we have been working on for many, many years, but we hadn't quite figured out how to articulate it in a way that made it central, right, for congregations. And I like to think of it, it's like the eighth principle became for us a center of gravity. So in the center of gravity, it has the ability to kind of concentrate the energy and the resources and the power. We've been doing anti-racism and anti-oppression work for a long time to various degrees. But we hadn't centered it as, like you said, as a part of our theological call. I think it was assumed, it was understood, but it wasn't named that way. The eighth principle named it, and in doing so, it gave us something to begin to really rally around, galvanize. And it has made a big difference. I would say the eighth principle is a compelling vision for our future. And it's compelling for many people who have not found Unitarian Universalism yet, or people who are beginning to see. If I came into a congregation, probably anywhere, but if I came into a UU congregation and I saw our principles, and the eighth principle was one of them, I would be so curious to know more about that community. And so, in some ways, the eighth principle may speak more profoundly to people who are not yet Unitarian Universalism than it does to those of us who are already here. Yeah.
We as a congregation adopted the eighth principle 2 years ago. And like many congregations, there's we want to live more fully into this vision. And there's no map. We struggle, and lots of congregations struggle and stumble. But you're offering sort of the next step in the conversation, but more than conversation, it really transforms into action. And this is your idea, your concept of shifting from a church family to the idea of a community of communities. What's the difference, and what will this community of communities bring into our congregations?
Yeah. So let's start with having adopted the eighth principle. By the way, congratulations. Thank you for your work on that. We adopted the eighth principle in the context of the existing organizational structure, right? Structure for church. And church is an institution, but let's think of it in terms of the church structure, which it functions, it works, but there are probably many parts of it that have not been examined, right? And for people who are already inside, it works, right? So you don't see perhaps where there may be limitations or challenges for new people to come and to find that sense of belonging. So we've adopted the eighth principle in the structures that were not designed to do what we are trying to do, right? We're not designed to do what we've been called to do. They were designed to maintain a set of values, a community, and they have done that. So, I'm not criticizing that. But the eighth principle and pluralism need a different space to be fully actualized. The existing church structure doesn't allow enough flexibility and opportunity for that to happen. In a community of communities setting, then our work is to look at and support the well-being of the communities. In the traditional church setting, it tends to lean largely towards the well-being of the individual members. Right? It's a big difference. And so community of communities offers us a way to, one, to be more agile as a community, and that we can address maybe more needs or interests than we currently do. We can respond in ways that the whole system doesn't have to say, yes, we can respond, right? But the communities themselves, people in a community, one, I would say, know what their community needs are, and two, can design programming to meet those needs. It's kind of simple in a way, right? And so we can look at that. Let's take a look at our religious education programs, right? So the people in that community, parents, the children, the volunteers, and the professionals who deliver religious education programs and participate, have a greater sense of what the needs of that community are than many of us who sit in the pews, right? Not only do they have a sense of the needs, but they can also design programs to meet those needs. So what if we optimized that through the whole church system? So it's not just religious education, but there are many, many communities that really already exist in your congregation, but the congregation functions more along lines of individual interests and needs. And so the community of communities gives us a way of I want to say positioning pluralism, not just theological pluralism, which is very important, but also identity is a part of that pluralism, age may be part of that pluralism, interests. People come to congregations with specific interests. And so the community of communities is a way that we can optimize our sense of welcome and the sense of belonging of people who become a part of it.
You know, Paula, a recent example of that was some folks coming in and discovering our congregation in Unitarian Universalism, and their own personal spirituality is earth-based pagan. And they came to us and said, we'd like to have an earth-based rituals group. And we were able to say, yeah, there's obviously a need for that. And within a month, they were meeting and celebrating together. So that kind of flexibility we have now, that this new community and bringing people who are coming on campus and seeing what we stand for. And maybe they're never going to walk in to the sanctuary on a Sunday. Maybe they will, but they found a community within this larger community. But it makes me wonder about this vision of becoming a more diverse, welcoming congregation. So how do you see the congregation of congregations, community of communities, extending to perhaps a marginalized group that might not necessarily be part of a congregation yet? How does community of communities translate into a sense of safety, inclusion, and an invitation to belong?
Yeah. And so it's there already in some congregations. The diversity that we often think about when we think about diversity is already present. And in the community of communities context, there are ways that people can come together, like I said, around common interests, common identity, and have experienced their church home or experienced their theological pluralism in the context of the UU community. of people who share something very closely with them. I think one thing that I hear in your question, I think that we will see over time is if people know that, well, let's say I may come to your congregation and maybe I'm really am interested in music and want to participate, as part of the choir or something like that. Um, and so that may be one of the things that draws me in. But then, as a BIPOC member of your congregation, perhaps there's already a BIPOC group meeting, or one that we can form, and so there's a community, two communities, right? Music and the BIPOC community, where I can find that sense of connection with other people, and also a place where my interests can unfold. Uh, so it happens, some of it might happen over time, that you may not have some of those communities formed currently, but you can be mindful now, right, in ways of forming them. And there are a lot of different ways that we can think about that, because you also have the external community. And if you're thinking about programming, the programming might be something that you do in partnership with someone, a group that is not a part of the church. And the programming is something that is offered and inviting for people who would come. And so it's kind of a process. It'll be a growth process. We will evolve into it. But what's important is that we kind of break out of the mold of traditional church and so much centering around one common culture in the church. And instead, we really start to very deliberately, intentionally look at ways that we can create spaces for that multiculturalism to exist in the larger community.
You mentioned breaking the traditional mold, and next month in June, Unitarian Universalism as a whole is going to be invited to break out of a mold that we've been loving and appreciating since the 80s, but over time, we're realizing that the way we were defining ourselves, presenting ourselves, was no longer relevant for many folks within Unitarian Universalism, especially younger folks. And also, we've heard from BIPOC members of Unitarian Universalism that some things needed to change. And so there's this very exciting possible transition from our 8 principles to 6 values, and the transformation of Article 2, the national bylaws. I've preached on it, and I'm actually going to preach on that in 2 weeks before the congregation votes on whether we want to endorse these changes. But I'm wondering, just briefly, why do you believe this is the time to bring a new vision to how we define ourselves and understand and experience ourselves as Unitarian Universalists? Why should we vote yes for the changes in Article 2?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Vote yes. It's very important to the future, to our place in the world. The current principles and sources and purposes that we have during the period of the 80s, that's what people did. They were voting yes to our place in the world at that time. That was almost 40 years ago. So much has changed. 40 years ago, in 1984 and 85, and I use those two numbers because we have to vote 2 successive years on accepting that portion of the bylaws called Article 2, but we won't use that language, right? That process was led by women. Mm. The social landscape for women had changed. And we came back I say we, I wasn't there, but we as Unitarian Universalists came back as we are instructed to do in our bylaws. Every 15 years, we're to take another look at this part of our bylaws that speak to our principles, our purposes, our identity as Unitarian Universalists. And they came back, and led by women, the language was changed to become more gender inclusive,
Yeah.
or gender neutral. And if anyone were to go back and read the earlier principles, you would see quite a difference. That happened because the society that we live in had changed. And women's, our understanding of ourselves and the rest of society's understanding of women had changed. So these changes are opportunities for us to update. I consider the eighth principle an update, long overdue update. What we are proposing with Article 2 is an update. It captures what we've been up to in the last 40 years, and it gives us, again, a framework and a vision for how we can move into the next 10, 15, 20 years of Unitarian Universalist ministry. We, those of us who are here now, are different than those who were, our age 40 years ago, right? And in the next 20, 40 years, the world that younger people are growing up in, they're going to be different and see different things and different needs, not just in the wider world, but in terms of our spiritual community. And they'll have an opportunity also to make our, again, kind of, we refer to these as identity documents, but let's say to make our shared values relevant to the times in which they live. And I want to say this. I think it's absolutely brilliant that instruction was written into the bylaws by earlier Unitarian Universalists. Absolutely brilliant. And we say revelation is never sealed, and we've created the context for us to live that out. That's what Article 2 is. It is a vision for us moving forward in the future.
Thank you for all your challenge. Thank you for all your vision.
Well, thank you. It has definitely been my pleasure to work with you and to work with your congregation, your church community. And I'm always excited to find Unitarian Universalists that are excited about this future that we get to co-create it. We co-create our reality, and we can make it the best possible.
May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.